Good evening, and welcome to Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the soothing accounts of truly remarkable lives. Tonight, we unravel the story of one of art's most captivating figures, a woman who spent half her life in bed but turned her broken body into Mexico's most valuable cultural export. Her face now appears on everything from tequila bottles to tote bags, that distinctive unibrow more recognizable than most presidents. But behind the mythology lived a woman who understood how pain could become paint. Before we start, a quick note. Playing ads is what lets us keep bringing you new bedtime biographies every week. But we know you're here to relax, so we've limited them to just 2. One before Chapter 1 and one before Chapter 2. After that, the rest of the story flows uninterrupted. And if you enjoy our work, a like and subscribe helps other restless minds find these stories. Please also let us know in the comments which figure you'd like to hear about next. Now, Frida's story has been told many ways, but the constant thread through every version is her resilience. She witnessed the Mexican Revolution as a child, and through it all, she painted in bed, in wheelchairs, in body casts that covered her from neck to hips. She painted things that made people uncomfortable, creating hundreds of self-portraits, not from vanity, but necessity. I paint myself because I am so often alone, she said, and because I am the subject, I know best. So settle in as we trace the path of this remarkable woman, from the blue house in Coyoacan where she was born, to the art that made her immortal. This is the bedtime biography of Frida Kahlo. Chapter 1. The Blue House on Londres Street. The story begins in 1907, or perhaps it begins in 1910. Magdalena Carmen Frida Kahlo y Calderon couldn't quite decide. She kept 2 birth years the way some people keep 2 sets of keys. One for the official records, July 6th, 1907. Another for the story she preferred to tell, 1910, the year Mexico exploded into revolution. In the quiet neighborhood of Coyoacan, just outside Mexico City, stood a house painted the deep blue of Mexican skies. Not yet the Casa Azul it would become, but a solid colonial home built by a German photographer who'd sailed across an ocean to reinvent himself. Guillermo Kahlo had arrived in Mexico as Wilhelm, carrying the weight of epilepsy and a Jewish-Hungarian heritage he'd learned to keep quiet about. Photography gave him a new language. Through his lens, he captured the grand architecture of Porfirio Diaz's Mexico, those last golden years before everything changed. Picture him in his darkroom, chemicals sharp in the air, while somewhere in the house his 3rd daughter played. She had his eyes, people said, dark, penetrating, seeing too much. Her mother, Matilda Calderon, came from Oaxaca stock, Spanish blood mixed with indigenous roots, Catholic prayers mixed with older beliefs. A beautiful woman who couldn't read but knew exactly how to run a household, how to make ends meet when her husband's seizures kept him from working. The house held 6 daughters and all their noise. Mathilde managed them with the efficiency of a general, though she saved her warmth for the older girls from Guillermo's first marriage. The younger ones learned early that love could be rationed like sugar during hard times. Frida would remember watching her mother cry in the pantry when she thought no one was looking. Strange how those stolen glimpses stick in a child's mind. Outside their walls, Mexico was changing clothes. The revolution had begun, though in Coyoacan you might not notice at first. The fighting happened elsewhere, in dusty northern towns and southern plantations. But change seeped through eventually. Zapatista troops would sometimes march past, and Matilda would hide the good silver, bundle the girls into back rooms. Frida, barely 4 years old, pressed her face to the window to watch the soldiers pass, their wide sombreros, their rifles catching sunlight. The blue house sat on the corner of Londres and Allende streets like a bright thought in a worried mind. Its rooms opened onto a central courtyard where organ cacti grew tall and strange. Bougainvillea climbed the walls in violent purples and magentas. The garden held fruit trees, their branches heavy with limes and oranges that nobody picked fast enough. They'd fall and split open, drawing clouds of drunk wasps. Years later, Frida would paint her family tree growing from this exact spot. She'd show herself as a child, holding a red ribbon that connected her to everyone who came before. Both sets of grandparents floating in the sky like patron saints, her parents in their wedding clothes, her sisters arranged like a bouquet she couldn't quite hold. In that painting, the house would appear small, almost toy-like, but its roots would run deep into Mexican soil, as if the house itself was another relative, as if its walls remembered everything. Chapter 2. Frida, Pater de Palo. 6 years old, and the world shrunk to the size of a bedroom. Polio had come for Frida like a thief, stealing the strength from her right leg and leaving her with 9 months of ceiling to memorize. The pain started as fire, then settled into something duller, like a tooth that wouldn't stop aching. Her leg began to wither. The muscles pulled away from the bone until it looked like something that didn't quite belong to her body. Ignoring 1.5, Mathilde would come in with bowls of soup that grew cold on the nightstand. Prayers muttered under her breath. Guillermo sat by the bed in the evenings, teaching her to see the world through a different frame. He showed her how light worked, how shadows told time, how to notice the smallest details that others missed. When she could finally stand again, her right calf was thinner than her left. Her foot had stopped growing. Back at school, children have a talent for finding the exact words that cut deepest. They chanted it like a jump rope song. Frida, Pater de Palo. Frida, peg leg. She learned to wear 3 socks on the thin leg, sometimes 4, a special boot with a higher heel to even out her walk. Still, they noticed. Children always notice. So she built herself a secret door. Not a real one, but something better. She'd breathe on the window until it fogged, then draw an entrance with her finger. Through that door lived another girl, a perfect friend who never asked about the leg, never stared. They danced together in a place where gravity worked differently, where legs didn't matter because you could fly. But Guillermo had other medicine in mind. No daughter of his would hide in imaginary worlds. He taught her to swim, though the public pool was no place for proper Mexican girls. He put her on a bicycle and ran alongside until she stopped wobbling. Soccer with the neighborhood boys, who forgot to pull their kicks when she played. Boxing lessons in the courtyard, her thin arms learning to throw real punches. She became two people then, the quiet girl who escaped through windows drawn in steam, and the loud one who cursed like a street vendor and tackled boys twice her size. Both were real. Both were necessary. The withered leg made her different, but different didn't have to mean weak. She'd learned to run faster on 1.5 legs than most could on 2. She'd climb trees that made her mother faint, just watching. Years later, she'd paint herself with wings growing from her shoulders. Not angel wings, but something stranger, more mechanical, as if she'd always known that the body could betray you, but you could build yourself new ways to fly. Chapter 3. The Prankster of the Preparatoria. 1922. Mexico City's National Preparatory School stood like a fortress of learning in the old city center. 2,000 students, 35 of them girls. Frida walked through those doors at 14, trading her schoolgirl braids for a new uniform. Overalls, like a mechanic might wear. A leather jacket she'd saved for months to buy. The other girls wore pleated skirts. She wore whatever made the boys forget to stare at her leg. The Preparatoria was Mexico remaking itself. In the courtyard, students argued about Marx and Nietzsche while eating tacos from street vendors. The walls themselves had become political statements. The education minister had hired artists to paint murals right onto the ancient stones. History lessons you couldn't close like a book. She fell in with the cachuchas, named for the caps they wore like a uniform of rebellion. 7 students who treated intelligence like a weapon and rules like suggestions. Their leader, Alejandro Gomez Arias, had the kind of mind that could dissect a philosophy text or plan the perfect prank. Dark eyes that noticed when Frida laughed at his jokes. They specialized in chaos with style. Firecrackers during solemn assemblies. A donkey ridden through the library, its hooves echoing off marble floors. The day she first saw Diego Rivera, he was standing on scaffolding in the Bolivar Amphitheater. 300 pounds of him, paintbrush in one hand, pistol tucked in his belt. Her friends saw a fat old man covered in plaster dust. She saw something else. The way he made walls come alive, the way he turned work into something holy. She told her friend Adelina, casual as discussing the weather, that she planned to have his baby someday. But Diego was tomorrow's story. Today belonged to Alejandro. Secret kisses in empty classrooms, letters passed between classes, pages of her thoughts, dressed up in her best handwriting. She wrote the way she talked, fast and hungry, switching from German endearments to street Spanish to quotes from books she'd devoured. Her mind didn't stay still, neither did her heart. The cachuchas turned the school into their personal theater. Once, they strung soap-soaked stairs to watch pompous professors slide into dignity-crushing heaps. Another time, they signed a petition to remove a famously boring teacher with names like H. Betico, which any fool could see meant helado de betún, shoe polish ice cream. The administration never caught on, too busy trying to build a new Mexico to notice the kids already living in it. 3 years of this, learning Latin verbs and communist theory, reading Hegel and writing love letters, watching Diego paint the creation of the world while she planned her own creation story. The girl with the withered leg had become someone else entirely, someone who could make a room turn just by walking into it. Chapter 4. The Steel Handrail. September 17th, 1925. An ordinary afternoon turning into something else. Frida and Alejandro had spent pesos they didn't have on a wooden bus painted bright as a children's toy. They sat in the back, probably arguing about something that seemed important, books or politics, or whether his parents would ever accept her. The streetcar came from the side, not fast, witnesses said later, almost lazy, the way disasters sometimes happen. But the bus was wooden, built for decoration more than impact. It exploded into pieces, like it had been waiting all along to come apart. The kind of sound that makes people forget what they were thinking about before they heard it. A metal handrail broke loose. It found Frida like it had been looking for her specifically. Entered through her left hip, traveled through her pelvis, exited between her legs. The physics of it were simple. The meaning of it would take her whole life to understand. Someone on the bus had been carrying a packet of gold powder, maybe for paint, maybe for some craft project that would never get finished. The packet burst. In the chaos, her clothes got torn away. So there she lay, naked and covered in gold dust, blood spreading beneath her like she was becoming a myth right there on the street. "La ballerina," people shouted. "The dancer! The dancer!" As if giving her a role might make sense of what they were seeing. They carried her to a billiard table in a nearby building. Someone's Friday night game interrupted by this broken girl who wouldn't stop screaming. Alejandro, barely scratched, stood there watching his girlfriend turn into something else. The inventory of damage read like a demolition report. Spine fractured in 3 places, pelvis crushed, right leg broken in 11 places, right foot dislocated, crushed, shoulder dislocated, 2 ribs broken. The handrail had done its own particular violence, her vagina torn open, the virginity she'd been saving gone in a way that had nothing to do with love. At the Red Cross hospital, they didn't expect her to survive the night. Then they didn't expect her to survive the week. The human body can take more than anyone thinks, but it keeps score. Everything costs something. She'd spend a month flat on her back, encased in a plaster cast that made her look like a broken statue someone was trying to piece together. Her parents arrived at the hospital. Matilda went silent for days, like speech had been stolen from her too. Guillermo, aged 10 years in an afternoon. They'd rebuilt their daughter once, after polio. Now the universe was asking them to do it again, with fewer materials and less hope. Chapter 5. The Birth of a Painter. A month in the hospital bed, then home to Coyoacán, to the same room where polio had kept her prisoner years before. The ceiling hadn't changed. Different cracks to memorize, same sense of life happening somewhere else. But this time, the sentence stretched longer. Months of plaster casts that started at her neck and ended at her hips, like being buried alive in your own body. Boredom becomes its own kind of pain after a while. She'd read everything in the house twice. Visitors came less often. Even Alejandro's letters grew shorter, full of excuses about university keeping him busy. She could feel him pulling away like a boat leaving shore, and she couldn't even sit up to watch him go. Her father's paint box sat in his study, forgotten since he'd switched to photography. She asked for it the way you might ask for water. Mathilde thought painting might keep her quiet, stop the crying that came at odd hours. They rigged up a special easel, nothing fancy, some wood and hinges that let her paint, lying flat on her back. Her mother had a mirror mounted on the underside of the bed's canopy. If she was going to stare at something all day, might as well be herself. The first real painting took months. 1926, a self-portrait in a velvet dress she'd never owned. She painted herself prettier than she was. Sadder, too. Like those photos people take after breakups, trying to show what someone's missing. She had it wrapped and sent to Alejandro with instructions. Hang it low, where you can see it as if you were looking at me. He hung it somewhere, probably. She never asked and he never said, but something had started that couldn't be stopped. The mirror showed her things she hadn't noticed before. How pain lived in the corners of her mouth, how her eyebrows met like two birds deciding whether to fight or mate. She painted herself over and over, each portrait a letter to someone who might understand. 3 years of this. Operations that promised improvement but delivered more scars. The doctors had a saying, one surgery leads to another. They opened her up, rearranged things, closed her again. Each time she healed a little worse, painted a little better. The brushes became extensions of her fingers. The colors knew what she needed before she did. I paint myself because I am so often alone, she'd tell people later, because I am the subject I know best, but that was only half true. She painted herself because herself was all she could control. In the mirror, in the paint, she could be whole, she could be broken, she could be both at once, and nobody could tell her which was real. Chapter 6. The Elephant and the Dove. 1928. Frida could walk again. Sort of. She found Diego Rivera at the Ministry of Education, painting workers and machines on government walls. She'd practiced what she'd say, brought 3 paintings wrapped in newspaper. The scaffold was maybe 15 feet up, but she called to him like they were equals. Come down here and tell me if I'm wasting my time. Diego weighed 300 pounds and moved like a man who knew his importance. When he saw her work, something shifted in his face. The next Sunday, he showed up at the Blue House, uninvited but not unexpected. Guillermo opened the door to Mexico's most famous artist, standing there in his good suit that didn't quite fit, asking to see the girl who painted. Mathilde served coffee in the good china, while Diego looked at every canvas in the house. "You have talent," he said, like he was handing her a passport to somewhere else. He started coming every Sunday, then Wednesdays too, then whenever he felt like it, 21 years older, married to Lupe Marin, who was beautiful and mean and threw things when she got angry. Frida's parents watched this unfold like a slow accident. Their daughter, still fragile from surgeries, being courted by a man who collected women like some men collect stamps. They called it the marriage between an elephant and a dove, but they needed the money Diego might bring, and Frida had already decided. She looked at Diego and saw past the belly, past the reputation. She saw someone who understood that art was worth bleeding for. August 21st, 1929, the civil ceremony in Coyoacan's town hall. She wore clothes borrowed from her maid, traditional Tehuana dress that made her look like she'd stepped out of Diego's murals. Her father got drunk enough to tell anyone listening that this was a tragedy. Diego got drunker, pulled out his pistol at the party, shot it into the air while wedding guests dove under tables. Lupe Marin showed up uninvited. Diego's ex-wife walked straight to Frida, lifted her skirts in front of everyone. "Look at these legs," she announced. "2 sticks. This is what you're leaving me for." The room went silent, except for Diego's laughter. He thought it was hilarious. Frida stood there, skirts still raised, and smiled like Lupe had paid her a compliment. That was the marriage from the start. Public scenes and private tenderness. Diego would disappear for days, come back covered in plaster and other women's perfume. Frida learned to paint while he was gone. She learned to be alone in a house full of people. She learned that loving Diego meant loving someone who couldn't be owned, like trying to hold water in your hands and being grateful for whatever didn't slip through your fingers. Chapter 7. The Tehuana. The transformation started slowly, then all at once. First, a rebozo here, an embroidered blouse there. Then, Frida walked out of the bedroom one morning, dressed head to toe as a Tehuana woman. The full costume, floor-length skirts that moved like water, huipil blouses heavy with flowers stitched by hands in Oaxaca, gold chains, and pre-Columbian jade. Diego looked up from his breakfast and smiled like she'd given him a present. The women of Tehuantepec had a reputation. They ran the markets in the isthmus, handled the money, made the decisions. The men fished and farmed while the women ruled. At least that's how the legend went. Frida had never been there, but she understood the power of a good story. She became what people expected to see when they looked at Diego Rivera's wife, more Mexican than Mexico itself. But the costumes did other work too. Those long skirts hid the leg that still wouldn't behave, the special boot, the limp that got worse when she was tired, the heavy jewelry distracted from the scars. When she walked into a room dressed like that, people saw the costume first, the woman second, the pain never. She turned herself into a walking piece of folk art. Diego's collectors loved it. Every morning became a ritual. The hair braided with wool ribbons wound around her head like a crown. Fresh flowers tucked behind her ears. Bougainvillea when the garden had it, marigolds from the market when it didn't. The heavier the jewelry, the better. She'd stand in front of the mirror for an hour, building herself piece by piece. Each ring had its finger, each necklace its meaning. Sometimes she'd paint herself getting dressed, the ritual itself becoming art, the same face in the mirror, but watch how it changed with each layer added. Bare, she was one person. Dressed, she became another, both real, neither complete. She learned to speak differently in costume, her voice dropping lower, her laugh coming from deeper in her chest. Even her Spanish changed, adding words from Zapotec she'd learned from the servants. Diego would take her to communist meetings, to fancy dinners with American collectors. She'd sit silent while the men talked, but everyone watched her. This exotic bird he'd married, some women asked where she bought her clothes. She'd name villages they'd never visit, describe markets that opened before dawn, women who'd been weaving since they were children, making them understand that her dresses weren't costumes, but armor. Years later, photographers would ask why she dressed that way. For Diego, she'd sometimes say, because he loved it. But that was only part true. She dressed like that because it made her feel like someone who could survive anything. Because under all that silk and gold, her body was still breaking. But nobody had to know that if she didn't want them to. Chapter 8. Frida in Gringolandia. November 1930. The train pulled into San Francisco like a metal snake, delivering them to another world. Diego had commissions to paint. Frida had nothing but her paints and her Tehuana dresses, which suddenly seemed like battle gear for the wrong war. Americans stared at her on California Street like she was an escaped museum piece. She stared back, writing to friends that these people looked like unbaked rolls, doughy, unfinished. They lived in Ralph Stackpole's studio, then moved to a house on Montgomery Street. Diego painted his allegory of California, while Frida painted herself smaller each time, like she was shrinking in this land of tall buildings and bland food. The rich ladies of San Francisco invited her to lunches where they served food with no taste and asked questions about Mexico like it was Mars. Detroit came next. 1932. If San Francisco was strange, Detroit was hostile. The city sprawled gray and angry under winter skies, smokestacks instead of mountains. The Detroit River moving thick with industrial waste instead of the clear streams of Coyoacán. She called it a shabby old village, though it was anything but old. Everything here had been built yesterday and was already falling apart. The Depression had hit Detroit like a biblical plague. Bread lines stretched for blocks while she and Diego stayed at the Wardell Hotel, where 1 month's rent could feed a family for a year. She watched from their window as men in good coats, coats that used to mean something, stood in line for soup. Meanwhile, Henry Ford threw parties where champagne fountains never ran dry. Diego was painting his Detroit industry murals at the Institute of Arts. 27 panels showing workers as heroes, machines as gods. He'd come home covered in paint and excitement, talking about the beauty of the assembly line. Frida saw the same factories and thought about what they did to the people inside them. How a man could work his whole life making the same small part of something he'd never afford. She got pregnant in Detroit. A mistake, the doctors said, given her pelvis. But she wanted this child with a hunger that surprised her. She'd already picked names. Dieguito for a boy, whatever Diego wanted for a girl. She consulted doctor after doctor at Henry Ford Hospital, each one more expensive than the last, each one saying the same thing: your body can't do this. But bodies had been telling her what she couldn't do her whole life. The rich Detroit ladies invited her to teas, where they complained about their servants and asked her to say something in Mexican, as if Spanish was too specific. She'd curse them eloquently, then translated as poetry about flowers. They'd applaud, delighted by their authentic Mexican friend. At night, she'd lie in the hotel bed, hand on her growing belly, and wonder what kind of world she was bringing this child into. Chapter 9. The Tragedy at Henry Ford Hospital. July 4th, 1932, Independence Day in America. But Frida woke to dependence of the cruelest kind. Blood on the hotel sheets, pain that felt familiar but wrong. The baby was leaving her body the hard way. Diego called an ambulance while she held towels between her legs, trying to keep inside what was already gone. Henry Ford Hospital was named for the man who'd perfected the assembly line. Even birth and death got processed efficiently here. They put her in a ward with 12 beds, white curtains between them like tissue paper walls. She could hear other women crying, couldn't tell if they were arriving or departing from motherhood. The nurses spoke English she didn't understand. Not the words, but the tone, professional sympathy. They'd seen this before. The fetus came out in pieces. 3.5 months of growing ended on an American holiday. The doctors used words like spontaneous abortion, as if her body had made a choice without consulting her. She asked to see what had come out. They said no. She asked again. They brought her medical textbooks instead, showing illustrations of what a fetus looked like at different stages. clinical drawings that looked nothing like love or loss. Diego came with flowers that made the room smell like a funeral. He sat in the visitor's chair, too big for the space, talking about his murals to fill the silence. She asked for her paints. He brought them the next day, along with a piece of metal she could paint on. Canvas seemed too soft for what she needed to make. The painting came fast and harsh, herself on the hospital bed, naked and bleeding, 6 red ribbons like veins floating from her body to the things that mattered, a fetus, perfectly formed and impossible, a snail, because everything had happened so slowly and so fast, a pink torso opened up to show the mechanics that had failed, a machine, because that's what the hospital felt like. An orchid Diego had brought, already dying, her own pelvis, broken and useless. She painted herself crying, but in the painting the tears looked decorative, like pearls. The bed floated above a Detroit skyline, the Ford factory in the distance, still making cars, while she couldn't make anything but art from her disaster. Blood on the sheets, blood pooling beneath her. But her face in the painting looked almost calm, like she was watching this happen to someone else. They kept her for 2 weeks. Other women came and left with babies. She left with a painting that would shock everyone who saw it. Too raw, critics would say. Too female. Too much body. Not enough metaphor. But she knew better. The metaphor was the body. Her body, which would never do what bodies were supposed to do, which would only ever give birth to paint and pain. Chapter 10. A Few Small Nips. 1935. Back in Mexico, Frida discovered that her sister Cristina had been posing for Diego, nude. The sketches were still in his studio, dated from the previous year. Her sister's body drawn with the attention Diego usually saved for machinery. When she confronted them, neither denied it. Cristina cried. Diego shrugged. "These things happen," he said, like he was explaining weather. Frida took scissors to her hair first. The long, dark hair Diego loved to paint, gone in 5 minutes of cutting. She left it on his pillow like a dead animal. Then she packed away the Tehuana dresses. Every one found a man's suit in a second-hand shop, gray wool, too hot for Mexico City. She wore it anyway, complete with tie and Oxford shoes. If she couldn't be Diego's woman, she'd be nobody's. The painting came from a newspaper story. A drunk man had stabbed his girlfriend. When the judge asked him why, he said, "But I only gave her a few small nips." Like murder could be minimal if you were careful about it. Frida understood the joke, even if the judge didn't. How men could destroy you and call it love. How they could apologize for the wrong things. She painted the woman naked on a bed that looked like hers, blood everywhere, on the sheets, the floor, the murderer's clothes. The man stood over his victim, still holding the knife, looking confused about how things had gotten so messy. Above them, a dove carried a banner with his excuse. Just a few small nips. The kind of thing Diego might say about Christina. Just a model. Just a sister. But the frame is what made people step back. She'd painted blood splatters on the wooden frame itself, breaking the boundary between art and reality. The blood seemed to leak from the painting into the world. Viewers couldn't stand at a safe distance. The violence touched them whether they wanted it or not. Diego saw the painting and laughed. He always laughed when she got too close to truth. Said she was being dramatic. Said Christina meant nothing. Said he'd already moved on to someone else, so why couldn't she? But Frida knew better. Her sister had been different. Family was supposed to be sacred. Even communists believed in something. She kept the suit for 3 months, cut her hair shorter whenever it started to grow, had affairs with women who weren't her sister, men who weren't her husband, painted herself with cropped hair and a scissors in her lap, surrounded by the locks she'd cut off. Above her, lyrics from a song. Look, if I loved you, it was because of your hair. Now that you are without hair, I don't love you anymore. Eventually the hair grew back. The dresses came out of storage. She forgave Diego because the alternative was leaving, and she'd already tried that. It didn't work. They were painted on the same wall. You couldn't remove one without destroying both. Chapter 11. The Old Man and the Affair. January 1937. A high-profile European intellectual arrived in Mexico after years of exile. Diego had arranged asylum through his government connections, offering the Blue House as a safe residence. Armed guards transformed Frida's childhood home into a fortress. The man was 58, with a white goatee that made him look like an angry prophet. His wife Natalia had the exhausted face of someone who'd been running for years. They moved into Frida's old bedroom, put bars on the windows, guards at the door. The famous exile now lived in Coyoacan, feeding chickens in the garden where Frida had played as a child. Diego was in the hospital with kidney problems when Frida started visiting the Blue House more often. To check on the guests, she said. The old man spoke French with her, a language Diego didn't understand. He had energy that seemed impossible for his age, walked miles every day, wrote thousands of words about his political theories, looked at Frida with an intensity that promised to change everything. She called him the old man in letters to friends, though he was one of the most famous intellectuals in the world. The affair began with books. He'd leave notes in them, pages marked where certain passages might interest her. She'd return them with her own notes tucked inside. They met at Christina's house when Christina was out. Her sister's betrayal turned into useful real estate. He would arrive separately, always checking for enemies who might be watching. His paranoia was justified. He had powerful enemies who sought to silence him. Natalia knew but said nothing. She'd survived poverty, exile, the death of both daughters, one son already lost to the political turmoil. What was one more betrayal? She sat in the Blue House learning Spanish, while her husband learned other things at Christina's. Frida felt sorry for her, which made the whole thing more exciting. Guilt was just another seasoning. The affair lasted a few months before Frida got bored. He was brilliant, but talked too much about political theory in bed. She started making excuses when he wanted to meet. By July, it was over. He moved out of the Blue House soon after, though they stayed friendly. Had to. Diego still believed in his political philosophy, even if Frida had stopped believing in him. She painted him a self-portrait as a goodbye gift, herself between curtains like a stage actress, dressed elegant, not Tehuana. She wrote a dedication with all her love, dated November 7th, an anniversary important to his cause. He hung it in his new house, where it stayed until his exile ended tragically 3 years later. The painting survived. Most things outlast their creators. Chapter 12. A painter in her own right. 1938 started with a visitor. André Breton, Pope of the Surrealists, came to Mexico expecting to find primitive art and exotic revolutionaries. He found Frida instead, took one look at her paintings and declared her a natural surrealist. She laughed in his face. "I paint my own reality," she told him. But Breton was French. He thought everything was about the unconscious. Still, he was useful. He arranged a show at Julian Levy's gallery in New York, her first solo exhibition. 25 paintings shipped north while she followed by train, checking into the Barbizon Plaza on Central Park South. The opening was November 1st. She wore her best Tehuana outfit, the one with gold thread that caught the light. Half of New York showed up to see Diego Rivera's wife, stayed to see Frida Kahlo's pain. Time magazine called her paintings a ribbon around a bomb. The critic meant it nicely. Edward G. Robinson bought 4 paintings on opening night. Other collectors followed. She sold half the show. Real money, not Diego money. She rode home drunk on champagne and possibility. This way, I am going to be free, free. Underlined 3 times. Paris came next, January 1939. Breton had promised another exhibition. She arrived to find nothing organized. Her paintings stuck in customs. Breton more interested in talking than working. Paris was dirty, she wrote to friends. The food made her sick. The surrealists were sexual perverts who sat around discussing their dreams like they mattered. But the Louvre bought the frame. First Latin American painting they'd ever purchased. Picasso gave her earrings shaped like hands. Kandinsky kissed both her cheeks and said her work made him want to cry. Marcel Duchamp, who impressed nobody, was impressed by her. She drank wine with them in cafes where the waiters knew everyone's name and nobody paid their bills. She also caught pneumonia, ended up in the American hospital with a kidney infection that might have killed her, wrote to friends that she wanted to come home, that Europe was rotten, that she missed Mexican food and Mexican light, sold enough paintings to pay for her ticket back, packed the earrings Picasso gave her, left the clothes Schiaparelli designed for her. The boat home took 3 weeks. She met a man named Nicholas Murray on board, Hungarian photographer with hands that knew what they were doing. They started an affair before the ship left port. He was handsome in an uncomplicated way, didn't talk about revolution or art theory, took pictures of her that made her look like a movie star. She needed that after Paris. Needed someone to see her as beautiful, not just interesting. Back in Mexico, Diego was having his own affairs. They lived in separate houses now, connected by a bridge he rarely crossed. She painted herself, sold paintings, saved money. The little international reputation making her bigger at home. No longer Diego's wife who painted, now Frida Kahlo, who happened to be married. Chapter 13. The Two Fridas. 1939 was the year of the divorce. Not because of any single betrayal, but from the accumulation of them. Like a bone that breaks not from one blow, but from thousands of tiny fractures. Diego said it would be better for her art. She'd be taken more seriously without his name. He said this while packing his things, which made the kindness cruel. The legal papers came through in November. Mutual consent, meaning nobody had to be blamed on paper. She started the painting while waiting for the final decree, the largest canvas she'd ever used, because some pain needed room to spread out. Two Fridas sitting on a bench, holding hands with themselves, the only comfort available when everyone else had left. The Frida on the right wore Tehuana clothes, the ones Diego loved. Her heart was whole, visible through her chest like those medical drawings she'd studied. A tiny portrait of Diego as a child sat in her lap, connected to her heart by a vein that wrapped around her arm. This was the Frida who was loved, the one who had a purpose, even if that purpose was just being Diego's. The left Frida wore a white Victorian dress, the kind, proper Mexican girls wore before the revolution. Her heart was broken open, damaged ventricles exposed. She held surgical forceps, trying to stop the flow of blood from a vein that had been cut. Blood dripped onto her white skirt, making flowers that looked intentional. The unloved Frida, the one Diego didn't want anymore. Behind them both, a storm gathered in grays and greens, the kind of sky that came before hurricanes. But the two Fridas sat calm, backs straight, faces forward, like they were posing for a formal portrait at a garden party where everyone else had gone home. The loneliness so complete it became its own companion. She drank her way through the divorce, tequila for breakfast, brandy for lunch, whatever anyone was serving for dinner. Cut her hair again, but not as short. Had affairs with men who weren't Diego, women who weren't Christina, painted herself with cropped hair and men's clothes, painted herself as a wounded deer with arrows in its body. Painted herself over and over, like she was trying to figure out who she was without him. The divorce lasted 1 year. By December 1940, they were married again. His idea, but she set the terms. No sex, He'd pay half the household expenses. She'd keep her own studio, her own money, her own name on her paintings. They married on his 54th birthday in San Francisco. She gave him a painting of herself as a present. In it, she wore the same necklace of thorns Christ wore as a crown. The same expression, too, resigned to a suffering that might save someone, though she couldn't say who. Chapter 14. The Broken Column. 1944. The doctors had a new solution, a steel corset, custom-made, 28 pounds of metal to hold her spine in place. She stood in the mirror while they fitted it, watching herself disappear inside this cage. The technician apologized for the cold. She told him she'd felt colder things. The pain had gotten worse since the remarriage. Not Diego's fault, just timing. Her spine was crumbling like old bread. The doctors showed her x-rays that looked like abstract art, white bones against black nothing, the spaces between vertebrae closing like doors. They recommended another surgery. They always recommended another surgery. She painted herself in the corset because what else was there to do? The broken column, she called it. Her body split open down the middle like a medical diagram. Instead of a spine, an ionic column, the kind Greeks used for temples. But this one was breaking apart, chunks missing, ready to collapse. The architecture of her body failing. Nails everywhere in the painting, through her face, her arms, her exposed torso, dozens of them, like she was a Saint Sebastian who'd annoyed more archers. But her face stayed calm. Tears, yes, but the decorative kind she'd perfected, the kind that made suffering look manageable. Behind her, a desert landscape, cracked like dried mud. Nothing growing, nothing living except her. The corset in the painting held everything together, but just barely. White straps against brown skin, looking both medical and sexual. She'd learned that about pain, how it could be intimate as love, how it knew you better than any lover. The corset was ugly but necessary, like so many things in her life. She wore the real corset for months, tried to paint in it, but the weight made her tired. Drinking helped until it didn't. Then came the pills. Morphine when she could get it, codeine when she couldn't, whatever the doctors would prescribe and sometimes what they wouldn't. Diego watched her fade into this pharmaceutical fog but said nothing. What was there to say? The body wanted what it wanted. Other paintings from this period showed the same theme. Herself as a wounded deer, 9 arrows piercing its body, running through a forest with no escape. Herself with a thorn necklace, bleeding, while a dead hummingbird hung from the thorns. Diego saw these paintings and bought her more canvases, better brushes, as if art could make up for what was happening, as if paint could replace what was being lost. The column in the painting would become famous. People would see it and think they understood her suffering. But suffering can't be understood from the outside, only witnessed. She knew that, painted it anyway. What else was there to do with pain except make it into something people could hang on walls? Chapter 15. Viva la Vida. 1953. They told her she couldn't go to her own exhibition. Doctor's orders. She'd been in the hospital for months, infections and surgeries blending into each other. But this was her first solo show in Mexico at Lola Alvarez Bravo's gallery. The world could end before she'd miss it. So they moved the bed, her four-poster from the Blue House, loaded on a truck like furniture for sale, set it up in the middle of the gallery. She arrived by ambulance, siren wailing through Mexico City traffic. They carried her in on a stretcher while photographers' bulbs exploded like small bombs. She wore her best Tehuana dress, jewelry that weighed more than she did, flowers in her hair that were already wilting. 200 people came. They drank tequila and sang corridos while she held court from her bed, like a queen or a corpse at its own wake. Hard to tell which. She told dirty jokes, flirted with young men, drank medicine she wasn't supposed to mix with alcohol. At midnight, they carried her back to the ambulance. The party continued without her. August of that year, the right leg had to go. Gangrene, the doctors said, like it was weather. Below the knee, clean cut, nothing to be done. She wrote in her diary, "They have given me wings to fly." But she didn't fly. She sank. Suicide attempts that Diego found just in time. Empty pill bottles hidden in her pillowcase. Notes that said variations of the same thing. I cannot live with this. But she did live another year of it. They gave her a wooden leg she named Rosa, painted it with designs, bells that rang when she walked, showed it to visitors like a new painting. Look what I made. Look what I've become. The visitors smiled uncomfortably, unsure if this was tragedy or comedy. It was both. Everything was both by then. Spring 1954. She painted watermelons. Strange subject for her, who usually painted herself. But these watermelons looked alive. Red flesh bursting with seeds. Juice that seemed to drip off the canvas. Life at its most basic. Sweet, messy, temporary. She painted 8 of them in her final days. July 5th, 8 days before she died, she picked up her brush one last time. On the brightest watermelon, the one that looked most like a heart cut open, she wrote her name, then 3 words that would outlast everything else. Viva la Vida, long live life. The kind of thing you write when you know you're leaving, but want everyone to know you were grateful for the party. July 13th. Her body gave up during the night. Pulmonary embolism, the certificate said. Diego found her in the morning, finally at peace. They dressed her in her favorite Tehuana outfit. At the crematorium, her body sat up in the flames, hair on fire like a crown, before falling back to ash. Even dying, she couldn't help but make it dramatic. Epilogue. The ribbon around the bomb. They sealed the blue house like a tomb after she died. Diego couldn't bear to change anything. Her wheelchair still at the easel, paintbrushes stiff with old oils, the mirror above her bed, reflecting nothing but ceiling. He'd go there sometimes, sit in her studio, talk to the paintings like she might answer. 4 years later, when his heart gave out, they opened the house to the public. Everything exactly as she'd left it. Even the half-eaten watermelon on the kitchen table, now dust. For decades, Frida was Diego's dead wife. The one who also painted museums would mention her in his biographies, a footnote in the larger story. Her paintings sold for thousands, while his sold for millions. Art historians called her work too personal, too female, too much body and not enough politics, as if the body wasn't political, as if being female wasn't revolutionary enough. Then the 1970s arrived, with its consciousness-raising and bra-burning. Feminists discovered this Mexican woman who'd painted miscarriages and heartbreak without apology, who'd turned her broken body into art that made people uncomfortable. Chicago muralist groups started painting her face on walls. Art students wrote dissertations about the female gaze, using her self-portraits as evidence that women had always been looking back. By the 80s, she was everywhere. Madonna collected her paintings. Salma Hayek started planning a biopic that would take 20 years to make. Fashion designers copied her Tehuana dresses, missing the point entirely. Her face appeared on tequila bottles, coffee mugs, tote bags. The unibrow became a statement. Young women dressed as her for Halloween, spirit-gumming fake facial hair like it was rebellion. The prices went insane. Self-portrait with thorn necklace sold for $5 million in 1990. By 2006, her paintings were breaking records. Roots went for $5.6 million. 2 nudes in the forest for 8 million numbers that would have made her laugh. All that money for pain she'd have gladly given away if she could have kept the health instead. But something else happened, too. Chronic pain sufferers found her in waiting rooms and hospital beds. Disabled artists saw someone who'd made immobility into a career. Queer women recognized the way she loved women while married to men. Mexican Americans saw their grandmother's clothes treated like high art instead of costume. She became patron saint of the wounded, the different, the ones who didn't fit. The merchandise got ridiculous. Frida soap, Frida band-aids, Frida tampons, her face on everything, usually cleaned up. The unibrow plucked to acceptable thickness. The mustache erased completely. The cigarette removed from her hand. They wanted her rebellion, but tidier. Her pain, but inspirational. Her difference, but not too different. Museums fought over her paintings. The Blue House became pilgrimage. 300,000 visitors a year walking through her garden, standing in her bedroom, trying to understand how someone could hurt that much and make something that beautiful. Tour guides repeated the same stories. The accident, the miscarriage, Diego's affairs. reducing her life to its worst moments, which she'd probably have appreciated. She always said she painted her own reality. Now her reality was what sold tickets. Mexico claimed her as national treasure. Her face on the 500 peso note. Airports named after her. The house where she was born declared a monument. The country that had once ignored her now couldn't stop celebrating her, as if they'd always known she mattered, as if they hadn't let her die broke, begging galleries to buy just one more painting to pay the hospital bills. Today, she's more famous than Diego. Google her name and get 100 million results. Young artists in Beijing and Nairobi paint self-portraits with her flowers in their hair. Disability activists quote her, "Feet, what do I need you for when I have wings to fly?" Trans men bind their chests and paint their scars the way she painted hers. Every wounded person finding in her work permission to exist loudly. She'd probably hate most of it. The commerce, the sanitizing, the inspiration porn. But she'd love that she'd outlasted them all. That a woman who spent half her life in bed became immortal. That her broken column holds up more than her own body now. It holds up everyone who's ever been told their pain makes them less than whole. Long live life, she wrote. Turns out, she meant it. Still awake? A message for the night owls. If you're still listening, you've outlasted most people. They likely drifted off somewhere around the tragedy in Detroit or during her final years in the Blue House. But you're still here, wide awake at the end of Frida's story. So for you, our fellow insomniacs, we have a mission. In the comments below, tell us 2 things. First, type the secret word baguette, so we know you made it all the way to the end. Second, tell us which historical figure you want to hear about next month. Someone whose life was complicated enough to matter. The first 3 people to comment with a suggestion get entered into our draw to have their name featured in that next episode. That's it. You made it through this story of perseverance, through gold dust and heartbreak. You deserve to help choose what story keeps you company next time you can't sleep. We'll be watching for you, the ones who never quite make it to sleep when they're supposed to.